That's the resource itself. You can assign it at the resource group level. If you assign it at the resource group level, let's say you assign it to this resource group and you have these resources under this resource group, then by default the resources will inherit the permissions at the resource group level. If you then have two resource groups that fall under a particular subscription and you define
So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about role-based access control. This term is abbreviated as RBAC or RBAC. So RBAC is a security feature in Azure that allows you to grant specific permissions to users, groups, or applications based on their roles in your organization. So you get very granular control over permissions that allows you to have increased security as well as increased compliance with your various regulations and policies. Now, at a very basic level, in order for a user to be able to do something either within your application or within Microsoft Azure itself, it needs to have permission. And what this means is that there's a table somewhere within Azure of all of the users and all of the permissions that those users have to act within your environment. At a very basic level, we can look at something like this and say, we want to grant student 1, which is a user, read access to this storage account 1. And that is a single permission listed in a table. But if you think about a larger organization with tens of thousands of users, and perhaps thousands of resources, including storage accounts and virtual machines and apps, and not only read access, but write access and ownership access. All of these types of permissions become very difficult to manage. You can take your 10,000 users, multiply by 1,000 odd permissions that they can have, and that gives you millions of permissions that would be stored in this type of table. So what is the drawback to this assigning individual permissions to individual users? Well, Microsoft has something called the principle of least privilege. It's more of a general policy within IT. And that is, in general, to have the best chance of having a high security system, you want your users to have the fewest amount of permissions that they can have. So don't just grant everybody in your organization administrative permissions. Try to be more granular and grant read permissions to people who only need to read stuff, update permissions to people who do need to interact with the data but don't need to own the data, and be very selective of who you give administrative permissions to. So if you're doing this types of one-on-one permissions to users mapping, you may have some users in your organization that end up with too many permissions. You can imagine somebody who's been with your company for years, let's say 10 or more years, have had a lot of roles in your organization, moving from job to job. They would then accumulate lots and lots of IT permissions on their user account. And their account is one of the more powerful accounts. Maybe other employees come to that person when they need assistance because they have permissions to do things that the employees don't. Inversely, you have some employees that are trying to do things that they should be allowed to do that end up not having permissions. You can have a brand new employee and it might take months before you assign them all of the right permissions that they need to do their job. So this increases the cost and the effort in order to maintain your permission system. You are going to have a help desk that's going to receive queries every day asking for permissions to do things. Then they have to wait for those tickets to be responded. It slows everything down and you end up with lower productivity across the organization. And because you do have users that have too many permissions, you have a higher chance of some type of attack, identity attack, where a malicious user gains access to your system and can do things that you don't expect them to be able to do. So there is a system called role-based access control. In this case, there's this concept of a role, which is like an abstraction. When you create a role, you're basically defining a job that someone can potentially need to do. May not map to your job titles, but you can sort of generalize what the roles are in your organization, who needs read-only access, who needs to be a contributor, and who needs ownership access to various resources. You can loosely define those into an abstraction called roles. And then you assign those roles to individuals. So examples of roles could be a developer role, a manager, development manager role, or an IT operations role. Maybe just somebody who needs to view reports and doesn't want to be able to affect the data in any way. And there's obviously going to be administrators of various sorts, including global administrators. These are roles that you can assign individuals to in your organization. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody can't be two roles. So you can be operations and you can also be a developer. And in this particular example, you can assign the two different roles to the same person. There would not be any conflict in that. And so you're just managing permissions at the role level. You're not assigning permissions to individual users. You only assign permissions to a role, and you assign the role to the users. And believe it or not, that actually simplifies the length of the table in this example for how many permissions you have. Instead of having millions of permissions when you have tens of thousands of users and thousands of resources, you may only end up with several thousand permissions. Makes it a lot easier and simpler for everybody. What are the benefits of role-based access control? Well, it is a level of abstraction that does simplify the management of permissions across your organization. A simpler management means fewer errors. As long as you can confirm that your users are assigned the right roles, then they should be getting the right permissions. If you ever run into a situation where a particular user needs a permission that's something outside of their role, then maybe you either need to define a new role or they need to be also a member, additionally a member of a second role. That's the decision you're making, not should I assign a new permission to a one-off user. Basically, all users are treated the same for their role. All developers have the same permissions. Nobody has secret extra permissions. When I say secret, it just means you do it once and then by tomorrow you've forgotten that you've assigned this permission to somebody, and then months and years later, then that comes back and bites you. And it's also easier for brand new employees who get started to just be assigned the developer role and not have to go back and find the 250 things that a developer can do. Now, that's not the only approach to security. There's also claims-based access control, or CBAC. But in the Microsoft Azure world, we tend to gravitate towards role-based access control. So it's one approach to simplifying permissions and simplifying those assignments. So in this video and then in the videos that follow, we're going to look at Microsoft Azure Portal and how to create roles and assign roles to individuals. So we're back into Azure Active Directory here in the overview screen. We've already talked about users and groups and external users. Let's talk about roles and administrators. Now, when I click on this screen, it's going to take a second to come up here, but it's important to keep in mind that we're only dealing with Azure Active Directory related roles, and these are typically called administrative roles. So we're going to see a list in a second here of all of the roles that are available to be assigned to users, but none of them have to do with low-level assignments. It's not dealing with individual permissions on a storage account or individual permissions in an app. These are all administrative type permissions. First thing I can see is it says your role, and it tells me that I'm currently logged in as a global administrator. If I was to log into Azure as a student or a teacher, remember I have teacher accounts that are help desk level users, then this role would reflect that. And in that particular case, I might not even be able to do anything on this screen. A lot of these things would be grayed out. So because I'm global administrator is what allows me to continue at this point. Now there's a list here of built-in roles. You see it says type built-in, and there's over 90 built-in roles that are all administrative related. We can see that application, the first one says application administrator, but what it relates to is managing app registrations and enterprise apps. So if we go back to the top screen here, we've got enterprise applications and app registrations. So being an application administrator simply gives me access to these features of Azure AD. Similarly, other roles within this list is going to give me access to other features. Now, in some cases, you've got administrator level permissions and you have reader level permissions. So you don't have the access in this case to modify the security attribute keys and values, but you can read the security attribute keys and values. And this might be important if you have applications that rely on reading these values, but you don't want those applications to ever modify them. So you'll see a lot of times it's split between administrator permissions and reader permissions. We even have global administrator and global reader. Global reader can read everything that a global administrator can, but not update anything. That's really interesting too. We already saw that you can have help desk permissions, password permissions, the knowledge management, license administration, so all you can do is just manage licenses. So this sort of goes into these very specific administrative roles. Okay? So this might be, you might be thinking that this is not very useful for day-to-day users. When you think about your employees within your organization, maybe only a small percentage, a single-digit percentage of them would ever have administrative permissions, and that's true. So this isn't the main way you're going to use RBAC going forward in terms of Microsoft Azure, but for administrative roles, this is obviously very important. All right, we've seen how you can manage administrative permissions inside Azure AD on the Roles and Administrators menu. And we saw about those 90 built-in roles, mostly having to do with admin stuff like printer management, password management, and Teams and SharePoint and things like that. But what about real resources like web apps, virtual machines, containers, things like that? How do you manage the permissions of users to those resources? I am back in my Azure portal. Now, I just signed up for a free trial on this account. It's eligible for it, I guess. And what I need to do here is I'm going to create a resource, and then that resource, we're going to see how we manage permissions to that resource using Azure AD. So I'm going to create a storage account as my first resource here. So I'm going to go and say create storage account. We have to create a resource group, so this is my first resource group. And we give the storage account a name. So this is my very first storage account. Let's see if that passes validation. I'm going to deploy it into Western Europe. And I'm going to choose the simplest options because we're not really demonstrating how to create a storage account here. We're demonstrating the permissions aspect. So I've created a fairly simple storage account. I'm going to basically go with the default versions on the Advanced tab here. We're going to go with the default versions on the Networking tab. We have the Data Protection tab, which is going to keep the default as well. Encryption, tags, and finally we're going to create the storage account. So remember, we do get a storage account free as part of this free tier, plus we're getting the credits as well, so it's not really going to be an issue. Now I did miss, I guess, on the Advanced tab that that we do have AD authorization as one of the options, and we can enable this after the fact. So we're going to leave this disabled, go back to the review screen, and say create here. This should create in under 60 seconds. We can see that the storage account was created in 30 seconds, so pretty good. I'm going to say go to resource. Now by default, because I didn't change the settings in the creation, storage accounts are secured by access keys. So this is an example of claims-based access control, or CBAC. If I have this security key, then I have the ability to have administrative permissions to this storage account. So anyone, anywhere in the world who has access to this key has access to this storage account if I've got public networking enabled, which I do. If you turn off public networking, then it's just an internal to Azure, and anyone internal to Azure would have access to the account with that key. So obviously claims-based control is convenient, but not always entirely safe. So what we might want to do is have this storage account secured by Azure Active Directory instead of the keys. So we're going to flip down to the settings here under configuration, and we're going to enable Azure Active Directory authorization, and this allows the role-based access control to be the security for this particular account. And at the same time, if we wanted to, we can disable the storage account key type of access. So disabling claims-based access control and enabling Azure AD control. That's one way to configure this. Now, by disabling storage account key access and enabling Azure AD access, there are some immediate implications. We saw when we clicked the disable for storage account key access, what we really did was we basically broken any access by keys, by shared keys, secured shared access signatures. All of that is immediately denied. So we've now any historical access to this account using storage keys is basically broken by doing this. So don't do this on a production account that has constant access by third-party applications and stuff like that. Now, if I go back to the overview screen here, we should see here, even on this overview screen, that storage account key access is disabled, and therefore the Active Directory access is enabled. We do this through the Access Control IAM tab. I can click this View My Access button, and I can see that I have an owner role across the entire subscription, and this is an inherited role. You know, I was obviously able to create the storage account, and I could assign other people permissions on the storage account, so I do have ownership role. But you might be surprised to say and to learn that I do not have access to the contents of the storage account. So currently, even with owner permissions on the storage account itself, I cannot read, upload, delete any of the files contained in the containers, file shares, any of the data in the queues and tables. So the data interaction permissions are separate than the resource permissions. In order to give myself the ability to upload files into the storage account, I'm going to go into Add Role Assignment. Actually, before that, I'm going to go into the oops. Three, two, one. So let's flip over to the Roles tab here, and we can see that there are dozens of roles relating to this storage account. Very important point. This is critical to role-based access control. There are basically three types of permissions. There is the reader permission, there's the contributor permission, and there is the owner permission. These are built-in roles. And we can see I'm going to expand the columns here a little bit. But we can see that the reader permission allows you to view all resources but does not allow you to make changes. The contributor permission gives you ability to manage resources but not assign roles. And the owner permission gives you full access to everything, including the ability to assign roles. So reader is read only, contributor is read and write, and owner is granting permissions and includes all of these things. As we scroll through the dozens of permissions related to storage accounts, we can see a common thread where you've got reader, contributor type roles, monitoring reader, monitoring contributor. The one that's relevant to us here is data blob reader and data blob owner and data blob contributor. Okay, so data blob reader, as it sounds, allows you to get read access to containers and data. The contributor will give you read, write, and delete access to containers and data, and the owner gives you full access to containers and data. So this is what I'm interested in to assign to myself. I actually have to assign myself permissions as a data owner in order to be able to work with containers. So I'm going to go into the Add tab here. I could have also done it if I go back to check access. There is this Add Role Assignment button as well. Two different ways to get there. And what I want to grant myself is I want to grant myself Storage Blob Owner. Okay, so I click on that and I say Next. And I'm going to select which members have Data Owner permissions. I'm going to give it to my two administrative accounts. Right, so two administrative accounts. I could put conditions on this if there is some type of more fine-grained access control, but I don't need that right now. And I'm going to say Review and Assign. And basically I've given blob data owner permissions to those two users. Now I will not have access to tables, queues, file shares at this point until I grant myself permissions. If I go back to View My Access, I can now see Storage Data Owner as being permission for myself, which is exactly what I want. I need this permission in order to start working with containers and with blobs. All right, so now that we've got ownership permissions over the data, right? So the data permissions are separate from the resource permissions. We can go into the blob storage containers, create a new container, call it my first private container. And that was successful. We go into the container, and we should be able to see that authentication method says that the authentication method is AD user. Now, if we had both AD user and access key permissions, we could switch back and forth between them. But remember, we disabled access key permissions, so this isn't going to be able to help us. If you are seeing a red box here with some permissions error, it may be that you didn't assign the data owner permissions to the user that you're using. So that's probably the most likely reason for an error. But in this case, I have the right permissions. I can say upload. I'm going to upload an image here, a JPEG file, PNG file, to the account. And so we've successfully been able to interact with the storage account. Now, don't forget that the traditional methods of interacting with this are no longer working. This SAS option, we don't have storage account keys. Anyone who wants to access this image requires Azure AD level permissions. Now, this might be a good time to talk about permission scope. I can actually assign permissions only to this container. Let's say I create a second container called second. So I have my first and I have second. I can assign permissions at the container level and not at the storage account level if I was wanting to. So if I go into access control, obviously I can view my own access and I can assign access. So let's say I want to assign data reader permissions. So not the ability to modify files or upload files, but just the ability to read the contents of a file. And I wanted to do that to my teachers. Okay. So I go teacher 1, teacher 2, teacher 3. So I can assign storage blob data reader to the teachers only on the my first container. I'm going to say review and assign. And we can see under scope, before I click it, this is a bit of Azure speak, but we've got the subscription ID, we've got the resource group, and then we have the storage account, and then we have a very first storage account, and we have containers, and we have my first. So this scope right down to the container level, right? So you can give scope to the subscription, scope to the resource group, which we haven't talked about, scope to the storage account, or scope to the container. Now there's a trick here. As we're working with storage accounts, if I go into view access to this resource, or I'll go into role assignments here, I can see that there are, for the scope, only the my first container, these people have access to it, but these other scopes are inherited. If I go to the second container, into access control, and role assignments, then the teachers do not have access to the second container. Right? So you can see that permissions can be assigned within Azure at various levels, from the specific container, storage account, resource group, and to the subscription level. Now, it's entirely possible that the roles listed here are not granular enough for you, or maybe there's certain permissions that aren't included that you would like to be included, or permissions that are included that you don't want to be included. So Microsoft has obviously created these 50 or 60 roles for you to choose from, but maybe it's not great for your circumstance. So there is this thing called custom roles. You have to be a Azure Premium P1 or P2 level in order to get access to custom roles. But basically what you can do is get right down into these super granular permissions and then be able to pick and choose. Actually, what I didn't ever show you was that if you look at these roles that have, let me just expand the names a little bit. If we go back to storage blob data contributor as an example, and I say view, this gives you an example of there are actually 6 permissions that are low-level permissions that are part of this role. Okay, and if I switch over to the JSON view, we can see here that there are these types of permissions: delete, read, write on containers, and move and add and things like that. Okay, data actions. So maybe, like I said, maybe some of these you don't want them to be able to delete. They can read and they can write, but deleting should be not allowed. That would be an example, a contributor that cannot delete. So you can do a couple of different things, right? You could assign them the contributor permission, and then you can actually assign them a deny assignment for deleting. That would be a bit complicated. This is the type of thing that if you forget to do it, they can delete. What you probably want to do is create a custom role. So we're going to go back to the home page. We're going to go into subscriptions, and we're going to go into the subscription that I'm dealing with here. And we're going to go down looking at access control. And this is the subscription level, so we can look again at the access and who's got access to the subscription. But what we're curious about and interested in is this create a custom role section. So I'm going to create a custom role. And I like that idea. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data contributor without the delete. Okay, and you name it something that is relevant. Storage blob data contributor without delete. Now you can see there are ways of getting about this. You can start from scratch, which means you're going to have to remember or look it up. What are the permissions a blob data contributor can do? Or probably more helpful would be able to clone this existing role. So I want to clone the storage blob data contributor role. I'm going to select it. So I'm going to start off by basically editing an existing role. That's probably maybe the easiest way to start. But what you're going to find when you get to some of the higher level permissions, like the owner permission is very simple. It's only got 3 assignments, and if you want to come back on the owner permission, it'll be a little bit more difficult. But at the contributor level, and we can see here, these are the permissions that are contained within this. We saw this in the JSON just a second ago. There are 4 action permissions and 5 data action permissions. So what I said I wanted to do is I wanted to remove delete permissions, and we can see here that there are permissions that allow me to delete containers, and I don't want this role to delete a container. And there's also deleting of the individual blobs, and so I don't want to delete the individual blobs. I'm going to assume read, write, and all of these other things are what I do want, but I don't want deleting of those things. Now by default, I'm assigning this to the subscription level, which means that this role is available for every storage account, every resource group, across every container across my thing. If I wanted to assign a user to this role, then they would apply to everything. An interesting thing here is I could say, really, I'm only interested in the resource group that's first RG, and so this role would be very contained to a specific resource group. But do keep in mind that there are limits. You can only create 5,000 custom roles. And so creating too many roles and too granular a scope, you might bump into that 5,000 limit. We can actually look at the JSON, and we can see here now we don't have the delete permissions. So it's identical to the storage blob data contributor role, but I don't have delete permissions. And I can say great, and I can say create. So I've created a custom role that does not have, it's a contributor without delete permissions. And so if I wanted to, let's say I say role assignment, and I'm interested in my custom role, which is this one, and I'm going to assign this custom role, the contributor without delete. I'm going to pick one of my students, so student 1, let's say student 1, 2, and 3. So these students can access blobs and blob containers, but they can't delete them. They can update them, they can read, write, and add, but they can't delete. So in this way, we've used a custom role to give ourselves more granular control over our permissions that the built-in roles aren't giving us. Now, we've previously discussed this concept of scope when it comes to access control. When you are making a role assignment, you are choosing the individual, the role, and the scope. Okay? And you can see here a couple of examples where there's subscription scoped permissions and there are resource scoped permissions for this storage account. But some students ask this, and it's actually quite a common thing to do in a production environment, in a real environment, is the resource group scope. So it's not uncommon to restrict access to individuals to certain resource groups. So you might have a resource group for development resources, and that might have a wide range of people who have permissions to access those development resources. And likewise, you might have production resources in a different resource group, and then you are able to restrict access to those resources to only specific individuals. So obviously you want the production individuals to be only a handful, whereas the development individuals could be dozens or hundreds. So that's a resource group scope. If we go into the resource group, I've created two, one for development, one for production. Go into access control, and I can say under role assignments, we can see that the number of people inherit access to this for storage blob contributors for this resource, and that's probably fine. But actually, maybe I want to have these students to have full contributor access to this resource group. So I can actually add a role assignment, and I can say contributor access. So I'll just, instead of doing specifically for blobs and for queues and things like that, I'll just say for the development for resource group, I have full contributor scope. So I'm going to say select members. And I'm going to focus on students 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So I want in the development group, for the development VMs resource group, these 3 students have full contributor access. Now this actually gives them full contributor access, and it actually, whereas the student blob contributor without delete role actually restricts their ability to delete, these permissions actually enables their ability to delete. So you'll see here that there's We can call it a conflict where you've got one set of permissions assigned here and one set of permissions assigned here. But really what's done is merged them. So I would expect the students 1, 2, and 3 to be able to delete files in the development resource group because I've just given them contributor access. Whereas in the production VMs, we can see that they are going to inherit this, this type of permissions. So unfortunately, once you've granted them permissions, there is this thing called deny assignments, but deny assignments can only be done through blueprints that map onto subscriptions. And so we cannot in the portal add a deny assignment. But maybe what I'll do for this is I'll only give them reader permissions. So if I say add role assignment, I'm going to choose the reader level. I'm going to choose the same members. And we can see that this reader access is on the production VMs. So they can see them, they know they exist, but they cannot modify them. They cannot stop them, they cannot reboot them, anything like that. So again, when you've got two sets of permissions for the same account, the permissions are merged. So you're not ever taking away permissions, you're just adding permissions. And so in this case, they've got a reader access to the whole resource group, and they've got specifically blob data contributor access without delete. So in this way, you can work with resource group levels to assign access, and it's quite common, and this is done in a production environment all the time. So the next requirement of the exam says to interpret access assignments. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can look at the way that others have access to our resources. One way you could do it is to go into the resource, in this case the production resource group, go into access control and under role assignments. And we can see a list of all the people and applications that have access to this resource group. Okay. So you can see that as the owner, I got the owner of the subscription. I've inherited access to this resource group. Remember we assigned reader access to 3 of the students, and we've assigned this blob data contributor without delete custom role to those same 3 students, and we can sort of see that here. Another way to see what an individual has access to is to go into Azure AD, go into users, pick the user, and there are 2 types of roles. Remember, we've been talking about this course. There's Azure AD roles, and so these are the administrative roles for your Azure AD, and there's none. And then there's the Azure roles, and there's 2 different menus to view the assignments on that. And so we can see that this user, student 1, has reader access to the production VMs resource group, contributor access to the development VMs resource group, and again, the storage blob data contributor without delete access at the subscription level. So these are the scopes, and these are the roles that have been assigned to this individual.
I'm sure you've heard the
phrase. We can go back here, we can pick one of the teachers. We can see that the teacher has been given both help desk and password roles at this in terms of this. Actually the password resource has been deleted. I'm not sure why the assignment is still there. We can easily remove that particular assignment. So he has help desk role to Azure AD. And if we go into the Azure roles, we can see that they've got data reader access to this entire storage account. So that is how we interpret access assignments within Microsoft Azure Portal. So far in this course, we've seen that when you assign permissions to a user or roles to a user, that the permissions end up being additive. That if you give more than one role to a user, what ends up happening is they get the sum or the union of all roles that they've been assigned. So if you look at this user student 1 and you ask what permissions do they have, the permissions that they have are the sum of all the permissions given by each role. Within Microsoft Azure, there's not really the concept of denying access to someone, specifically and explicitly denying access. So let's give an example. Let's say I did want to assign storage blob data contributor role, and I wanted to remove the delete permission. What I had to do was create a custom role. We saw this in the custom role video, but I could not have just assigned them the base role and basically explicitly denied them the deletes. So the only way to deny access is not to grant them access at all, if that makes any sense. Now, you may see when you're mucking around with Microsoft Azure that there is this concept of deny assignments that is listed. If you go into a resource and you go into access control, you'll see deny assignments has a tab. But you cannot create a deny assignment. It's not a feature. Now, it does mention that the only way you can add your own deny assignments is using blueprints, but that's not even entirely true. When you add a blueprint to a subscription, what you're doing is you're superseding the permissions of that subscription at a higher level. And what they want to do is remove the ability of people to undo the superseding. We're not going to talk about blueprints in this course. It's not a topic of the exam, but we can switch over to the Blueprints tab, the Blueprint service really quick here. Now, a blueprint is a template for a subscription. And there are 4 types of resources a blueprint can contain. Those are ARM templates, Azure policies, role assignments, and resource groups. And so you can collect these things together. Let's say you have 10 subscriptions for your organization, but you want to have a set of roles, a set of assignments, a set of ARM templates that all subscriptions have access to. Well, blueprints are a way of inheriting default settings into brand new subscriptions. So if I go and say create, I don't have any blueprints in this account. I could create a blank blueprint and start creating my own set of properties and artifacts. There are also about a dozen samples we can choose from, and we can see that we have a couple of UK samples like UK NHS typical samples, SWIFT, which is the International Banking Standard. We've got ISO 27000